Hey there, I'm Mattea Roach, and welcome to Bookends. I remember very distinctly the first time I was introduced to the work of Charles Burns. It was a couple years ago. I was at a cottage, summer-long weekend. I was talking graphic novels with a friend, and that friend said to me, Mattea, if you love graphic novels and you haven't read Charles Burns, what are you even doing? Charles is an icon in the world of American comics. His work can be dark and disturbing, but it's also funny. He tells weird and sometimes surreal stories through the eyes of young people. And Charles's new book, Final Cut, bears that signature. Graphically, it's stunning. Think rich, deep color and dramatic shadows, kind of like a film noir or a pop art piece. Like a lot of his work, Final Cut is set in the 1970s and centers on the lives of teenagers. And it draws on some of the classic sci-fi and horror movies that have inspired him as an artist. Charles Burns was recently in Toronto, and I was thrilled to have him join me in our studio. Hi, thank you so much for coming in.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So in the first scene of Final Cut, we meet our main character, Brian, who's this quiet and artistic teenager, and we see him at this house party, but he's kind of not in the center of the action. He's not really chatting with the other people around. He's sitting alone in the kitchen and he's drawing in his sketchbook. How did this scene come to be?
Well, I'd been struggling for quite a while. I had finished a longer book and I had like 5 false starts trying to figure out some idea that I was happy with, something that I could immerse myself in. And it was incredibly frustrating. And I finally just said, okay, just do a 7-page story, beginning to end. If you can't do that, then figure out something else you're going to do because this is not working. And I stumbled on this idea of, well, a memory of me sitting and taking many substances at that point, sitting in a friend's kitchen and doing a self-portrait, looking at my reflection in a chrome toaster, like an old-fashioned chrome toaster. And the idea of sitting there and just having this kind of longing for some connection with someone, the fantasy of like some incredible person would walk in and suddenly discover me sitting there with my drawing and admire this drawing and somehow seeing who I was. Obviously, that never happened. On the other hand, that was the starting point for what initially was a short story. Yeah, it really started that way.
To give listeners who haven't looked at Final Cut sort of a description of what kind of self-portrait we're talking about, it definitely does, the self-portrait we see Brian drawing, very reflective of what you're saying of the sort of self-portrait that someone might draw if it's the early 70s
right.
and substances are involved. It's
right.
like this human body with this bulbous kind of brain-like, alien-like head just expanding out. And Brian kind of refers to himself as a compressed alien sitting at another table in another world. There's that sense of separation and
right.
maybe not being seen by the people around him. Is that in some way how you felt as a teenager? Like, were you tapping into that a little bit in creating this story?
Yeah, absolutely. I always had this kind of disconnect, or felt that kind of disconnect, which I think it's when you're in your adolescence, I think that's generally true with probably most everybody. But I struggled socially, and the way I found myself in the world or found my way in was through drawing. And it was like, oh, that's who you are. That's the person you are. It was how I defined myself, and I still do for the most part.
That makes a lot of sense. I mean, that sense of isolation that I think a lot of people feel as teenagers, I really related to it reading this story. Mm-hmm. I am not a visual artist. Right. Drawing was not the way that I kind of found an escape. But for me, it was more writing, mm-hmm. getting involved in like listening to music, other kinds of creative projects.
Right.
And this realm of teenagers and this sort of sense of adolescent isolation and malaise is something that you have returned to in a lot of your works and that you depict really vividly. How you've managed to stay so attuned to that experience of teenage isolation, and it's so lived in your work. You're now approaching 70 years old. How have you stayed tapped into that for such a long time? It's really impressive.
Well, I was telling you earlier that I was really struggling after my previous book of trying to find this story, and I was kind of consciously trying to I can't do another story about teenagers. And so I had all these other attempts. Here's this middle-aged guy that's doing this and that. And I was like, I hate this. I can't find my way in. I have no attachment to this. So I can't really explain why that is other than I kind of key into that very vivid, strong emotional feelings that I had. Not that I haven't had them as an adult, but somehow those really extreme images and ideas kind of blossomed at that point in my life. And so I find myself continually going back. There's something there that I find myself drawn to, this kind of rich emotional life.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the way that I think about it, and I don't have as much distance from the experience of being a teenager, but I think enough to have some read on it, is that when you're, 16, 17, 18, so many of these emotional experiences that you're having them for the first time. Mm-hmm. The first time that you fall in love, the first time that you experience real heartbreak, the first time that you are using substances and seeing what your relationship to that is going to be like, the first time that you're engaging with works of art on a really deep level. And so everything is so intense and everything is like the most important thing that's ever happened to you.
Right.
This specific teenage intensity draws a lot of artists back, it seems. I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on that, I guess?
I don't know. I mean, I was thinking about what you were saying. I think in all of my work, maybe I've got younger characters, but I'm also filtering in experiences I have as, in my adult life or my current life. So whether they come in not so directly, they get filtered in there as well. Mm-hmm. So it's not based entirely on specific events in my life, although there's some details there. Mm-hmm. I've had friends say, oh, I'm that character. And I'm saying, no, if I was doing you would be very different. I would portray you in a different way. There's someone who kind of is a stand-in, maybe physically for you, but I'm injecting myself into that character and not doing some version of you.
Yeah, there's layers that can kind of come in as more time passes and you gain sort of new kinds of perspective on what those early teenage experiences are like.
I mean, and you were talking about the characters or the fact that they're youthful characters. With my wife, I raised two daughters, so I was around when I was working on Black Hole, for example. They were kids growing up, and I would have to flip over some of the pages. Like, no, you're not. When you're 18, you can see this, but I did have that experience of not reliving that part of my life, but experiencing what they were going through and having some memories of like, oh, here's things that I'm not remembering because I'm seeing my daughters experience these kind of intense situations and seeing it from the perspective of an adult, like being a parent and working through those things.
Yeah, seeing it kind of anew, I guess.
Yeah.
So this new book, and I'm so glad you brought up Black Hole because there's some kind of things that are different and some things that are similar between Black Hole and the new work, Final Cut. Final Cut centers on this group of friends in the Pacific Northwest in the 1970s. And so we have this main character, Brian, who I mentioned before, and his friend, Jimmy. And they're these real, cinephiles, I would say. They're aspiring filmmakers. They're really into horror and science fiction. And they like to shoot their own 8mm movies. And the main thrust of the story is this new project that they're working on putting together. What inspired you to give your main characters this specific creative interest?
Yeah, that reflected what I was doing at that age. I was living in Seattle out in the Pacific Northwest, and I had grown up looking at horror magazines, monster magazines, and in the back of those magazines, there were advertisements for 8mm copies of what tended to be very cheap horror movies. But for me, looking at those ads, they were like, oh, that's $5. And, I don't have a projector, but it was this kind of fantasy of like, what, God, you could watch those movies anytime you wanted because they weren't accessible at that point. There was, occasionally a show on TV that would come up, but they looked really exciting. So somewhere around ninth grade, I guess 14, 15 years old, I met a friend who had all those movies. His parents had a movie camera, they had a projector, a screen, and so we would go over to his house and look at these very cheap, ridiculous 8mm movies like I Was a Teenage Frankenstein or Varan, the Unbelievable. And they were, we knew they were cheesy and the quality was really low quality, but they were still, it's like we sat and watched them all and enjoyed them. And that kind of led us to this idea that, oh, we have a camera, we could actually film our own movies. Mm-hmm. And that's what we started doing. The story kind of comes out of that part of my life, the idea of creating something with your friends. And in Final Cut, it's very clear that these two friends, Brian and Jimmy, have been working on those kinds of movies, and they have a whole history together of making those movies. And the sense is like, oh, this is kind of like, this might be like our last go round. We'll do one more movie, but we're closer to adulthood than we are to being little kids. So they're kind of clinging to that kind of youthful friendship and that bond, but there's the distractions and the changes of being, young adults.
Yeah, definitely. You can see kind of that tension of, on the one hand, Brian kind of wants to take the art more seriously. He's thinking more seriously about directorial choices that he's making. Right. Jimmy is kind of maybe maturing in other ways of like, what if we sex up these movies? I want to ask specifically about Invasion of the Body Snatchers, because that's a film that within the context of Final Cut, Brian and Jimmy are really inspired by. Right. And you beautifully illustrate some scenes from that movie in Final Cut. What's the premise of that film and why does it appeal to your characters specifically?
I mean, it's such a ridiculous movie, and the core of it is a male and female character, the protagonist and his girlfriend. They realize what's going on in this little town. Basically, their parents, their friends, their children are being taken over by these alien pods. All you see are these kind of weird, long pods that show up. And their friends and family all look and act pretty much the same, but there's some sort of emotional disconnect. And if you fall asleep, you're going to get taken over by these pods. So the core of what I was interested in is the main protagonist and his girlfriend, they have to stay up. They're taking amphetamines all night, and they're trying to get out of town and escape this kind of horror. And there's one scene where they're in some cave, which is perfect, and he realized that she's fallen asleep while he's gone away for just a few seconds, and then her eyes open, and then he knows instantly that she's gone.
I went to sleep, Miles, when it happened.
Oh, Becky.
They were right.
I should never have left you.
Stop acting like a fool, Miles, and accept us.
No. Never.
He's in here! He's in here!
So there's something about that, having those two characters that are in love with each other, and then that disconnect, that kind of emotional disconnect. My protagonist, Brian, is in the movie theater, and his friend looks over and she sees that he's got tears streaming down his face at the scene that I just described. So, that's the best I can describe.
I think that was a very vivid description, and I'm so glad that you brought up the connection with how that shows up with Brian watching this film with Laurie, his friend that you mentioned. Because that's there's a parallel between the male and female character in Invasion of the Body Snatchers and what we see with this relationship between Brian and Laurie. Laurie is also a character whose mind we get to inhabit during this book. There's a lot of it that takes place in her perspective. Right. And to go back to that opening scene from Final Cut, Brian is at this house party, sitting in the kitchen. Laurie comes in and she's beautiful. She has this striking red hair and she exhibits this interest in Brian's artwork and what he's doing. What does her interest at that point in time mean for Brian?
Well, it's not entirely clear whether she's pranking him a little bit. She's teasing him a little bit. So she walks in and she does this whole thing of, oh, where'd you learn how to draw? And he doesn't know how to answer her because he's kind of overwhelmed by her presence. And then he finds out that she's a friend of his buddy Jimmy. And then she explains, oh, Jimmy told me to ask you that question. So there's a kind of a gray area where he's kind of overwhelmed by what he's hoping is this kind of attraction or connection with somebody, but it's not entirely clear because he's saying, well, where did she come from? And was she lying to me? Was she being serious? What was that about?
Laurie becomes the lead actress in this new movie that Brian and Jimmy are making. And we actually, as I mentioned before, get to inhabit her perspective. We get her point of view as well.
Right.
And I'm wondering, what made you want to switch characters in this way and show us the world through Laurie's eyes?
Well, I've done it before. In Black Hole, I also had two narratives, two protagonists, a male and female, and I wanted to have two sides of the story, kind of adding some depth to the characters to show who they are and seeing her perspectives of him and bouncing back and forth.
I think it's interesting specifically because Laurie is this like central preoccupation for Brian and is this object of fascination. He doesn't objectify her in a way that felt super leering, but he is obviously, he's a teenage boy. He's like fantasizing about her. And I think that getting to inhabit her perspective for me really as a reader kind of takes me out of that objectifying position and gets to see like, well, this is a woman who also, you know, is changing from a girl into a woman. She's also an adolescent, figuring out her own desires. And we see this sort of classic adolescent plotline that I think most people go through in some way or another of she's the object of this guy's affection. Her desires lie elsewhere.
Right.
Now, I don't want to give away too much plot, but there's this queer romance plotline for Laurie that I didn't see coming, but I was really excited to see as a queer reader of the book. And I'm wondering what it was that you wanted to explore, including this queer relationship, particularly given that this is a book that's set in the early to mid 70s.
Right.
Very, very different time for somebody to be exploring that compared to like when I was coming out in the 2010s.
Well, again, the way that I write as I go, and the most interesting part about that is discovering things that you didn't anticipate. So originally, the very kind of skeletal structure of the story, Jimmy was going to be, you know, the kind of, oh, here's my best friend who gets the girl that I'm attracted to. And then I was working on it, I was just like, I don't know, it's like, do I need to go through that same typical scenario? And it sounds odd, but as you're working, sometimes there's just like a character who shows up and like, oh, what if these two are interested in each other? So there's a scene early in the story where they're at Jimmy's birthday party and they're looking at movies. And there's an interaction between the main protagonist, Brian, and Laurie. And somewhere in the background, this girl is just kind of looking at Laurie. And it was just an incidental background character. But somehow there was some thing that happened. I'm like, oh, well, what if they're interested in each other? Or what if they've had some romantic attraction to each other? So that just opened up another, just something much richer for me to think about and to look at.
I want to talk a little bit now, Charles, about the graphic style of Final Cut because it is stunning and it's so immersive and it has this almost pop art feel to it for me. You're known for a really sharp and high contrast style. There's like heavy shadows. There's a film noir vibe to a lot of your work. But what's different with this book compared to some of your earlier work is there's an expansive color palette with like deep reds and purples and really bright teal. And then we also see some beautiful natural tones of landscape. A lot of the scenes take place with the characters hiking and camping. Can you chat a little bit about your use of color and what you wanted to evoke in this book with the color?
When I was starting out as a cartoonist, I looked at a lot of black and white work and I admired a lot of black and white comic work. And that had to do in some cases with the limitation of printing, of what was cost effective. Printing in color back in the day was very hard. So I kind of trained myself and at the same time was always attracted to a certain style of this very strong black and white work. But eventually I reached this point where I had access to doing full color artwork. And for me, that opened up all kinds of possibilities. For example, the main character in Final Cut has red hair. So if you're seeing her from behind or seeing her from a distance, you immediately know, oh, she's the one that's got red hair. Because I tend to do, most of my characters look very similar. That's kind of a cartooning thing I do. But there's elements in using color that are great devices for storytelling. And I think in this most recent book, I've kind of expanded some of the things I'm doing, like really thinking about color in a different way. As you're saying, there's getting up in the mountains and doing these very kind of beautiful vistas, just wanting to really use the richness of color as a part of a storytelling device.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I want to ask a little bit more about how you found your way into comics and why this is the art form that you've chosen to work in for your whole life. I understand you were interested in drawing and art from a very early age. Was that something that was encouraged within your family growing up? Like, where did you get this interest?
Yeah, it wasn't discouraged. And I think that both my parents, we had a lot of books around the house. We went to the library every single week and had stacks of books. And my father especially was interested in art and sculpture and illustration and comics, which was very unusual, especially in the late 50s and early 60s. So there were books around the house that I would just pick up and look at and somehow internalize some of those very strong images at a very early age before I was actually reading. And also, I have an older sister who's like 3.5 years older than me. So my mom was a stay-at-home mom, and my sister was off at school. So for about 3 years there or so, I was just like hanging out with my mom, who was an only child and didn't know about play dates and socializing her son. So I was just hanging out by myself in this house and looking at books. And, I'd say, tell my mom that I was bored. She'd say, oh, sit down and I'll here's some paper. Keep yourself busy with doing a drawing. And I think early on, I was like copying things, like copying a book cover. And I remember one day, a very specific moment of just like, I think as a child, you can usually tell like a genuine adult response. And I remember I had done some drawing that was copying these knights in armor or something like that. And then just seeing this kind of like, oh, this is really good, and not just kind of trying to pat you on the head.
Mm-hmm.
And so obviously you think about any response like that, like, oh, I want more of that.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was just like the kind of very early core memory of like, I enjoyed drawing, but I also had a response from other people from that. And so again, talking about defining who you are as a person, it was like, oh, we moved around a lot when I was a kid. And it's like I was socially inept in many cases. And it was like, oh, he's a guy that's drawing. So that was my kind of entry point in some cases. Yeah,
that's like your thing. It's kind of the one thing that people know about
right.
you. Yeah. Yeah, hearing you talk about like getting this validation and that being so important because it's so true. I think that often adults want to encourage kids and
right.
they think that kids are not as emotionally attuned as they really are.
Right.
Whereas kids are probably, if there's one thing they're good at, it is emotional attunement, right?
Right.
And sensing when someone is sincere. And also interesting that you pointed out it was a bit unusual that you had parents that were like into comics. It was something that was not necessarily like the most top respected art form at the time.
We moved around quite a bit, but I felt like I got settled like probably at the end of grade school in Seattle. And, just the friends that I made around there was no one who was interested in comics and that sort of thing. And it was very clear to me that hearing references from my friends' parents and things like that it was still had this kind of stigma attached to it. It's like, okay, this is something you might be able to read it, but then you throw it in the garbage. Mm-hmm. It's not something you're going to hang on to or, consider important. But, in my house, it wasn't something that was encouraged, but it wasn't discouraged either.
Mm-hmm.
And so I tried to stay under the radar. I just, behaved myself as much as I needed to, just so I could walk down to the woods and smoke a joint and come back and draw stoner drawings in my bedroom.
That's not bad, if you can get away with that as a kid, you're living a pretty good life.
I got away with it most of the time, not every time, but yeah.
Yeah. I want to ask a little bit about your early career because it's interesting. Yeah, comics were for a long time seen as something where it's like they're cheap. It's often superhero stuff,
right.
kids stuff that was not taken seriously as an art form. And when you were first starting out in your career in the early 1980s, we didn't have quite the same culture around graphic novels being seen as this like serious art form. And you struggled a bit to find a place in the comic scene from what I understand. Mm-hmm. And a lot of your early work was in Raw magazine that was being published in New York by Art Spiegelman and Françoise Mouly. What was the impact of that era and Raw magazine on you and your career?
Well, after I graduated from high school, I went to art school, and I just had this very vague idea of like, I've always drawn. I like comics, but I saw myself as an artist. So I did painting and printmaking and did a whole lot of, tried a whole lot of different things. But I was always doing my comic work on the side. And I'd never met another cartoonist, a professional cartoonist. And it's a long story, but eventually I got to meet Art Spiegelman and Françoise Mouly, and I had seen the very first issue of Raw on the stands in New York City because I was up there trying to show my portfolio around. And I kind of instantly thought, oh, this is this kind of publication that I've always imagined. It's kind of oversized, beautifully printed, and there's this kind of oddball, intense graphics, this graphic quality. And initially, Art serialized his book Maus in little pamphlets in the magazine. So anyway, Art was the first person I met, and he was a great person to meet because he had just incredible knowledge of the history of comics, and he was the first person who really looked at that side of my work very seriously. And I think one of the first times we sat down and talked, and I brought up a whole stack of drawings, and there was one page that was kind of a series of abstract images, interrelated images. And he was just looking silently for a long time. And I started getting nervous, like, oh. And I started trying to kind of point out, explain what this thing was about. Like, no, that's against the rules. And I thought, oh, I get it. He's just looking at it very carefully, and he's taking it seriously. Mm-hmm. And so in a way, we're talking about validation. That was a certain amount of validation for me as well. And we're still close friends after all these years. And he was incredibly helpful and generous in that I would visit regularly. And it's like, oh, do you know so-and-so? And like, no, I've never heard of that. He had kind of access to all these exotic European authors that I'd never heard of and stacks of books. And it was this incredible education for me just to be suddenly meeting other artists, talking with him for hours on end. So yeah, that was really kind of the starting point of finding my way into getting my comics published.
That's so cool to hear about, because I think for me, as for so many people, Art Spiegelman was my entry point into the world of
so many people.
Yeah, comics, graphic novels. As you said, like he wrote Maus. It was like got a special Pulitzer because they didn't even know at that point how to categorize the work. They were like, this is serious, like journalistic almost reporting, but also art, but also comic. What do we do? Yeah. And then Françoise Mouly has been the art editor at The New Yorker for years. Yeah. And I think that the sort of common thread between the work that they've done and your work and really this like world of comics that sort of developed through people that were getting published in Raw in the 80s is there's this like dark sensibility and ability to grapple with very deep, sometimes sinister subject matter. Your work in particular has a like dystopian and surreal vibe a lot of the time. If I look back at like Black Hole, for instance, there's definitely like an eeriness to it. Final Cut, I would say, has a lot of that dread, teenage angst, surrealism, particularly in the dream sequence, but it's also very grounded in real life and real teenage problems. And there's a bit of like a hope and redemption vibe towards the end of the story. It doesn't end on a particularly dour note. Did you feel that this was a bit of a shift in your work, or did it feel like a natural evolution from some of the stuff you'd done before?
Maybe a natural evolution. I'm not sure. Again, I was telling you that the way that I write, the story is always in flux. It's always something that I'm considering as I'm working. Maybe this, should I try this? And initially, I wasn't sure what that ending was going to be, and I didn't know how hopeful that ending was going to be. And I do think of it as being this kind of positive, hopeful ending. It's ambiguous, but I don't know. My previous book was just so dark and so depressing, I suppose. I don't know. I still stand by it. But yeah, this was like a little bit of a shift. I'm like, all right, maybe there's going to be a little light that gets to enter into the story that is this kind of positive shift.
Yeah. I mean, Brian is in an interesting place at the end of Final Cut, I would say, where he a bit being stymied in some of his artistic and romantic pursuits, a little bit disappointed and frustrated. But he also has this ability to kind of write his own narrative, that he has this amazing imagination. He has clearly a lot of artistic inspiration that he's drawing from some of these experiences that are difficult. And that gives him a bit of an ability to control his own story and exert some agency, which is something that teenagers often are lacking.
Right.
And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about what art can offer people that are maybe experiencing these kinds of personal, professional, romantic, whatever frustrations.
For me, it's always just this kind of odd urge to tell this story, and I can't explain it in any other way. I'm never thinking of an audience. Obviously you're working for print and you anticipate that there's a book that's going to come out or some kind of publication. But for me, the urge is always, and it's not therapeutic. It's some inexplicable thing I can't quite put into words. It's this urge to tell that story or it's formulating ideas as you're working. And I've never believed in the idea that if you kind of express these things and you get it out of your system, they're obviously still in my system. But yeah, I'm not sure if I'm answering your question.
No, I think there's a lot in there. The idea that you're talking about, that there's just this like drive and this engine that I think a lot of creative people have, where it sounds like you're the sort of person, and the character Brian in Final Cut is the sort of person that would want to make art even if there was no one to see it. Like there was just a need to tell these stories and a need to express.
Yeah, I would definitely be doing something, whether it was going down to my little local print shop and printing up some Xerox copies of my comics or something. Yeah, I would find something. I feel I've been incredibly lucky to find an audience that's interested in my work. But there's something that happens when I'm sitting at a table, and every once in a while, it's just like, oh, this is working, and there's something that's happening there that is, I can't explain it, but it's like feeding back to you. Something is feeding you something that's strong, and that's what I'm kind of still chasing after, that feeling of like, oh, discovery. You discover something new.
It's so beautiful to hear that that's still a feeling that you can get after having, a long career in so many different phases of it. Charles, it's been such a pleasure speaking with you, and I myself have been trying to get more into an artistic and creative practice that's not my job. And I think hearing you talk about this process and the drive to create and just to sit down at the table and let things flow, it makes me want to go home and write in my journal.
Oh, good. I mean, that happens to me as well. Every once in a while, there'll be something that inspires you. I need to go home and work. So yeah, I appreciate your close read on my book, Final Cut. And I enjoyed your questions. So thanks.
Thanks so much. That was my conversation with Charles Burns about his graphic novel, Final Cut. This episode was produced by Katie Swales with help from Lisa Matthews and Barb Carey. Our senior producer is Jacqueline Kirk, and our executive producer is Aaron Balser. I also want to shout out our audio techs and the rest of the CBC Books team for everything they do to make this show happen. I'm Mattea Roach, and this is Bookends. You can tune in on Sundays and Wednesdays on CBC Radio or follow the show on the podcast app of your choice. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time. Because when the book ends, the conversation begins.